The morning they fired me, I had already cleaned 3 operating rooms, changed the flowers in the children's ward, and helped an elderly patient find the elevator because no one else had stopped when he asked. My name is Grace Walker. I was 58 years old, and for 27 years I worked as a janitor at St. Catherine Medical Center in Portland, Oregon. Most people never noticed me unless a trash can was full or a floor was wet. Doctors walked past while reading charts, administrators spoke over me as if I were part of the furniture, and young employees often assumed I had started only a few weeks earlier. I never corrected them. I knew every hallway, every night nurse, every broken vending machine, and every quiet place where families went when doctors gave them terrible news. I also knew which patients had no visitors and which interns skipped meals because they could barely afford rent. That hospital had become more familiar to me than my own small house. Then a new executive director named Richard Cole arrived and announced that St. Catherine needed to become efficient. He hired consultants, replaced handwritten schedules with software no one understood, and began studying employees as numbers instead of people. At 9 that morning, his assistant asked me to come to the conference room. Richard sat across from me with 2 folders and never offered me a chair until I pulled one out myself. "Mrs. Walker," he said, "your position is being eliminated as part of a restructuring." I looked at him quietly. "Who will clean the surgical wing at night?" He glanced at a spreadsheet. "An outside company." I asked whether the company knew that room 412 flooded whenever the west pipes froze, whether they knew the pediatric oncology floor required fragrance-free products, or whether they knew Mr. Alvarez in dialysis panicked when strangers entered without knocking. Richard frowned. "These details will be documented." I almost smiled. The hospital had spent years depending on knowledge nobody had ever thought important enough to write down. He pushed the folder toward me and said security would collect my badge at noon. I signed nothing, packed my spare shoes, an old photograph, and a coffee mug chipped along the rim. Before leaving, I stopped at the executive office and placed a yellow envelope on the secretary's desk. "This belongs here," I said. She barely looked up. On the front, written in black ink nearly 3 decades earlier, were the words, "Open only if Grace Walker ever leaves this hospital." Richard did not see the envelope until 2 days later. His secretary found it beneath a stack of insurance reports and brought it into his office because the handwriting on the front matched the signature of Dr. Samuel Bennett, the physician who had founded St. Catherine Medical Center. Dr. Bennett had been dead for 19 years, and his framed portrait still hung in the main lobby. Richard later told me he almost threw the envelope away because he assumed it was some sentimental note left by an elderly employee. Then he noticed a second sentence written across the seal. "This letter concerns the legal and moral ownership of St. Catherine." He called the hospital attorney before opening it. Inside were 6 handwritten pages, a copy of an old loan agreement, and a photograph of a much younger version of me standing beside Dr. Bennett in an unfinished hospital corridor. The first line read, "If Grace Walker has left this hospital by choice, thank her. If she has been forced to leave, correct the mistake before reading another word." Richard continued anyway. The letter explained that in 1998 St. Catherine had been weeks away from closing. A failed expansion project, unpaid debts, and an insurance dispute had left the hospital unable to meet payroll. Banks refused further credit. The board prepared to sell the building to a private developer who planned to convert it into luxury apartments. At the time, I was 31 and had worked there for less than a year. What the board did not know was that my late husband, Thomas Walker, had inherited shares in a regional construction company. After he died in an industrial accident, I received a settlement and sold the shares. I had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life. Instead, I gave almost all of it to St. Catherine through an anonymous emergency loan. The amount was $2.4 million. It covered payroll, stopped the sale, and kept the emergency department open until new funding arrived. I asked Dr. Bennett to keep my name secret because I did not want a board seat, public attention, or people treating me differently. I wanted to work. I wanted to remain useful. The agreement stated that the loan would never require repayment as long as the hospital continued operating as a nonprofit and Grace Walker was treated as a permanent member of the institution. If that condition was violated, the remaining legal interest in the founding trust would transfer to me. Richard, read the final paragraph twice. Grace does not clean this hospital because she has nowhere else to go. She cleans it because after losing her husband, she decided saving lives mattered more than being recognized for saving them. If anyone mistakes her uniform for her value, that person is not qualified to lead what she preserved. By Friday afternoon, Richard had called an emergency meeting with the hospital's legal team, board chair, and chief financial officer. The documents were authentic. The emergency loan had been converted years earlier into a protected charitable interest representing 12% of the hospital's original foundation trust. Because Catherine remained a nonprofit, no one could sell those shares, but the holder had voting rights over executive appointments, major contracts, and any change affecting the hospital's mission. Legally, I had more authority than Richard. I had simply never used it. The board began reviewing my personnel records and discovered that for 27 years I had refused promotions, awards, and even pay increases beyond standard union adjustments. They also found hundreds of small notes in departmental files. Grace covered the medication cost. Grace arranged transportation. Grace stayed with the family. Grace found the missing records. Grace noticed the oxygen alarm before maintenance arrived. None of those acts appeared in official reports because I had always asked people not to mention them. Dr. Helen Park, the chief surgeon, told the board about a winter night when a power failure struck during an emergency operation. While administrators argued over procedure, I led engineers through a service corridor no one else remembered and helped restore the backup line. A pediatric nurse explained that I had quietly paid for hotel rooms when families could not afford to stay near sick children. The pharmacy director produced receipts showing that an anonymous fund had covered medications for low-income patients for almost 2 decades. Every receipt carried the same initials, GW. Richard began asking how much money I still had. The answer embarrassed him. Almost none. I had spent most of it over the years helping people the hospital's assistance programs could not reach quickly enough. I lived in a 1-bedroom house, drove a 12-year-old car, and owned no investments beyond a small retirement account. When Richard asked why no one had told him, Helen Park answered, "Because you never asked anyone below management what they knew." The board suspended the outsourcing contract and ordered Richard to contact me immediately. He called 6 times. I did not answer. He sent flowers. I gave them to my neighbor. Finally, the board chair, Alina Shaw, came to my house herself. She stood on my porch holding Dr. Bennett's letter and said, "Grace, the hospital may have broken its agreement with you." I looked at her and replied, "The agreement is not what concerns me." "Then what does?" she asked. I thought about the employees who had been dismissed without anyone learning their names. "You only discovered my value because a dead man wrote it down." I had no desire to watch Catherine suffer, but the problems began almost immediately. The outside cleaning company sent different workers every night. They used strong chemicals in the pediatric ward, triggering an asthma attack in one child. They locked a supply room that needed to remain accessible during emergencies. They disposed of a box containing a patient's prosthetic equipment because it had been placed beside the wrong cart. None of the mistakes were intentional. The workers had simply been given maps, codes, and checklists instead of knowledge. On the 4th night, a pipe burst behind the old radiology unit. I had warned maintenance about that pipe every winter for 13 years. The new crew noticed the water only after it reached an electrical panel, forcing the hospital to close 2 floors for repairs. Staff members started calling me directly. I explained where the shutoff valve was, which storage room contained the dry barriers, and which elevator could still reach the affected wing. I helped them over the phone because patients did not deserve punishment for an executive's arrogance. Richard came to my house the next morning. He wore no tie, his shoes were wet, and for the first time he looked less like a director and more like a frightened man. "We need you," he said. I opened the door but did not invite him inside. "You need someone who knows the building." "No," he replied. "We need you." I told him that was still the wrong answer. A hospital should not depend on one invisible employee while refusing to respect an entire class of workers. He looked confused, so I explained. The night cleaners knew which patients wandered. The kitchen staff knew who had stopped eating. Receptionists recognized frightened relatives before doctors saw them. Orderlies noticed changes in breathing because they spent more time beside patients than executives ever did. Catherine had treated all of them as replaceable. I happened to have a letter proving I was not. The others did not. Richard asked what I wanted. I handed him a handwritten list. Restore every dismissed support worker who wanted to return, create paid training instead of outsourcing, establish an emergency patient fund, place a support services representative on the hospital board, and end executive bonuses for any year in which frontline positions were cut. He read the list and said the board would never approve everything. "Then the hospital does not need me," I answered. Before he left, I added one final condition. "Do not rename a hallway after me. Do not hang another portrait. Learn people's names while they are still standing in front of you." The board meeting lasted 7 hours. Richard argued that my demands would increase operating costs. Eleanor Shaw asked the finance department to calculate how much the recent failures had already cost. The burst pipe, closed floors, emergency relocation, contract penalties, and patient claims totaled more than the annual salaries of every support worker who had been dismissed. Dr. Helen Park presented evidence showing that experienced cleaning teams reduced infection rates, that trained orderlies prevented falls, and that stable kitchen staff improved recovery for long-term patients. The financial argument collapsed. Then the board reviewed the emergency patient fund I had maintained privately. Over 21 years, I had spent nearly $640,000 on medications, travel, temporary housing, burial costs, mobility equipment, and food. I kept handwritten records because I never wanted reimbursement, only proof that the money had gone where it was needed. One entry concerned a young medical student named Daniel Ross, whose mother was dying from cancer. He had planned to leave school because he could not afford both tuition and her treatment. I paid the remaining costs anonymously. Daniel was now the head of emergency medicine at St. Catherine. When Eleanor told him the truth, he sat in silence for several minutes before saying, "I thought the hospital had helped us." She answered, "Grace was the hospital." More stories followed. A nurse whose rent I covered after an abusive marriage. A family whose premature twins survived because I paid for a hotel near the neonatal unit. A surgeon who had once been a homeless teenager and received textbooks from an unnamed donor. I had not changed their lives alone. I simply acted during the gap between need and bureaucracy. The board approved every condition except one detail. They wanted to offer me a formal executive role. I refused before they finished describing it. "I do not want an office," I said when Eleanor called. "I want a key that still opens the supply room and permission to tell the director when he is being foolish." Eleanor laughed for the first time in days. The agreement was finalized the next morning. Support workers were invited back with improved wages and full benefits. The outsourcing contract was terminated. Richard's bonus was eliminated and redirected to the patient fund. The board added 2 permanent seats for frontline employees. Then Eleanor asked when I would return. I looked at the uniform hanging inside my closet and realized I did not miss the mop or the long nights. I missed knowing the people inside those rooms. Monday, I said. But I am not returning as though nothing happened. On Monday morning, more than 300 employees stood in the main lobby. Someone had told them when I was coming, though I had specifically asked for no ceremony. Nurses lined the stairs, kitchen workers stood near the cafe, and doctors filled the corridor. When I entered wearing my old gray uniform, the lobby became completely silent. Then Daniel Ross stepped forward. He was holding the photograph of his mother that he kept in his office. "I know what you did for us," he said. I shook my head. "Then you know it was private." "It was," he replied, "until your privacy allowed us to forget what kind of place this should be." Others began approaching. Some thanked me for money. Others thanked me for conversations I barely remembered. One former patient said I had sat beside her for 3 hours after a miscarriage because her husband was overseas. A retired nurse told me I had prevented her suicide by noticing she had given away her lunchbox and asking one extra question. I felt overwhelmed and slightly angry because gratitude can become another way of turning a person into a symbol. I raised my hand and asked everyone to stop. "I did not come back so you could applaud me," I said. "I came back because there are rooms upstairs that need cleaning, patients who are frightened, and workers who deserve to be seen before someone finds an old letter." The lobby remained quiet. Then I walked toward the elevators and asked Marcus, one of the night orderlies, how his daughter's college interview had gone. His eyes filled with tears because I remembered. That was the point. Richard met me on the surgical floor carrying a new badge. It no longer said janitor beneath my name. It read community steward and founding trustee. I handed it back. Too many words. He smiled nervously and produced another badge, Grace Walker's staff. I clipped it to my uniform, better. Richard worked differently after that. He spent one night each month shadowing a support department. The first time he joined the cleaning team, he lasted 4 hours before admitting his back hurt. The staff did not forgive him immediately, and neither did I. Change is not proven by speeches. It is proven by what someone does when no one is watching. 6 months later, infection rates had fallen, employee turnover had dropped, and patient satisfaction had risen. The hospital saved money not by cutting people, but by keeping experienced ones. Then a leaner brought me another sealed envelope, Dr. Bennett had written it for me personally, but I had never opened it. I took the envelope to the old hospital garden where Dr. Bennett and I used to drink coffee during night shifts. His handwriting had faded, but I recognized the careful shape of every letter. "Grace," the note began, "you will probably believe staying invisible protects your freedom. For a while it will. But invisibility also allows institutions to benefit from goodness without learning from it. One day, someone may need to know what you did, not to praise you, but to understand what must be protected." I sat on the bench for a long time. Dr. Bennett had known me better than I wanted to admit. My secrecy had never been pure humility. Part of it was fear. After Thomas died, people treated me as fragile, wealthy, or tragic. At St. Catherine, the uniform gave me a place where no one asked about the settlement or expected me to become someone important. Being overlooked had felt safe. But safety had a cost. Richard could fire me because the truth about my role belonged to a dead man and a locked envelope. The hospital could celebrate kindness as a miracle instead of building systems that made it ordinary. I brought the letter to the next board meeting and proposed a new program called the Grace Standard, though I objected to the name. It required every department to document institutional knowledge from frontline workers, create emergency support plans, and include hourly employees in policy decisions. More importantly, it created a fund financed by executive compensation and private donations to help patients before paperwork delayed care. I insisted that no recipient ever be photographed for publicity. Richard supported the proposal without trying to attach his name to it. That mattered. The program passed unanimously. Over the next year, 3 other hospitals adopted the same model. I traveled to speak with their support teams, not their executives. I listened to cafeteria workers, security guards, transport staff, and cleaners explain what administrators repeatedly missed. The lesson was always the same. People closest to suffering often see solutions first, but institutions rarely ask them. On the 28th anniversary of my first day at St. Catherine, a leader announced that the board planned to rename the main medical building. I immediately refused. She told me the decision had already been made. I prepared an angry speech until she showed me the final name. It was not Grace Walker Medical Center. The new sign read, the Walker Bennett Center for Human Care. Beneath it were smaller words, named for 2 people who believed a hospital must recognize the human being before the role, diagnosis, or account number. I could live with that. 5 years later, I finally retired from full-time work. I was 63, my knees hurt, and younger employees had learned almost every secret of the old building. I still visited twice a week, officially as a trustee and unofficially because Mr. Alvarez in dialysis refused to drink his tea unless I reminded him. St. Catherine had changed. Not perfectly. Hospitals are large, complicated places, and good intentions do not eliminate budgets, mistakes, or exhaustion. But employees knew that anyone could speak at board meetings. Support workers received training, pensions, and names on their badges large enough for patients to read. The emergency fund helped thousands of families without asking them to perform gratitude for cameras. Richard remained executive director. He became less polished and more useful. On my final official day, he walked beside me through the lobby and apologized again for firing me. "You already apologized," I said. "I know," he replied. "I'm still learning that regret doesn't expire after one conversation." Near the entrance, a group of nursing students stood beneath the old photograph of Dr. Bennett and me in the unfinished corridor. One student asked why a janitor appeared beside the founder. A senior surgeon named Daniel Ross stopped and answered her. "Because without her, there would be no hospital." The student looked confused. "Was she wealthy?" Daniel smiled. "For a short time." "Then why did she keep working here?" He looked toward me before answering. "Because she understood something many educated people forget. Saving a building means nothing unless you also protect the people inside it." I walked outside into the cold Oregon morning and sat on a bench near the garden. A young cleaner named Sophia joined me during her break. She told me she was studying nursing at night but felt embarrassed because some doctors treated her as though cleaning was all she could ever do. I asked whether she did the work carefully. She said yes. I asked whether patients trusted her. She nodded. "Then do not say you are only anything," I told her. "Every honest job teaches you something about people. Carry it with you when your title changes." 2 years later, Sophia became a registered nurse in the pediatric ward. On her first day, she sent me a photograph of her new badge beside the old cleaning badge she kept in her locker. Underneath, she wrote, "I learned to see patients before I learned to treat them." That evening, I placed Dr. Bennett's letter back inside its envelope. For 27 years, people believed I was an ordinary janitor. They were right about one part. I cleaned floors, emptied bins, and changed beds because those tasks mattered. What they failed to understand was that ordinary work and extraordinary value can exist in the same person. St. Catherine was not saved by the richest person in the building. It was saved by someone who knew that kindness becomes powerful only when it refuses to look away. The end.